welcome to this elemental session on creating zero carbon schools. As everybody here knows, decarbonising schools is a massive task. They make up just over a third, including universities, of public sector building emissions. So we're joined today by three people with a vast amount of experience in this sector who are going to share some of their expertise when it comes to decarbonising school buildings, whether that's creating net zero new build schools or probably the trickier task, tackling the existing building stock. The panel today consists of Mike, who is Managing Director at Mantis Energy, Alex, who is the schools lead for Ashden, which includes the Let's Go Zero 2030 campaign, and Nigel, who is Business Development Director at ReEnergise projects. So the first question, which hopefully is an easy one to begin today, I would like to ask you all to introduce yourselves and explain your perspective on zero carbon schools. Starting with Nigel, can you introduce yourself and explain where you think schools are currently at when it comes to their understanding of what a zero carbon school even means?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Lucy. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Nigel from ReEnergise. I think the best way to describe us is as the architects and enablers of state decarbonisation plans and programmes for the education sector. We work in schools and colleges, we not yet in any universities. So we would draw up a state decarbonisation plan for a school, which would involve gathering energy usage data, site surveys, and then produce a plan which explains to the school how they're going to decarbonise their heating, which is a big challenge, their power, and as that relates to the heating, and if they've got any school transport, how that would be brought into the equation as well. We work with lots of multi-academy trusts, dioceses, some single sites, and our focus is on the decarbonisation of what I would describe as complex, multifaceted school estates in terms of retrofit, not new builds, because it's retrofit where the challenge is. And we do assist with grant applications as well, which I think schools find something of a struggle, and we might want to talk about that later on. Do you want me to go on with the second bit where I think schools are at the moment as well? Okay.
Yeah, if you could.
There's been I've been in this business now about 7 years, so a relative newcomer, I suppose. There's been a significant rise in interest in net zero in the past 18 months to 2 years. And I think that has a lot to do with the introduction of the public sector decarbonisation scheme. I think that quite a lot of schools and colleges are enthusiastic to do what they can, but they're also nervous about it and they're uncertain what it means, and they need support and advice and guidance in understanding that and understanding what are the practical things that they could do. They undoubtedly need help with applying for grants and securing grants, because that is something of a minefield, I think. And if I say it's something of a free-for-all, that might seem a little bit pejorative. It's not meant to be, but I think that's quite challenging. I also think, from my experience of implementing projects, or the company's experience of implementing projects, they are remarkably resilient when it comes to undertaking or seeing through these quite challenging retrofit projects, because they are quite disruptive. And I'm sure Mike will, he's got more experience with that than I have, actually. That's one of the features. But they keep smiling as you need to. So that's probably enough from me for a starter, I suspect.
And then if we can move on to Alex, can you introduce yourself and explain what Let's Go Zero is, and maybe a little bit about what some of the schools have achieved as part of the project so far?
Well, hi there. Lovely to be here today. My name's Alex Green. So I work for Ashden. We are a climate solutions charity based in London, and we lead on the Let's Go Zero campaign. That's a campaign for all schools, colleges and nurseries across the UK to be zero carbon by 2030. So very ambitious. And it's all about ambition, really. It's about schools showing where they want to be, not always knowing how they're going to do it or the steps that they're going to take, But the very first step is to show where they want to be and how they want to be leaders within their community. So we've been really impressed with the amount of schools that are signing up to show their demand. We've got over 1,500 schools, colleges, nurseries across the UK now signed up to say they want to be zero carbon by 2030. And then we're taking that voice, that demand, and using it to help really create policy change. So they're achieving a lot by simply just showing their ambition. So we know that already schools are working together, sharing their ideas. We have a webinar program that they can come and learn from what schools are doing, because none of this is rocket science. It's so much of it is about just really good practice and really good processes within schools before we even get to the complicated retrofit and all that side of it. So much of it is just about the way that we behave in our buildings and the way that we manage them. But there are also opportunities that they can take, and they learn from each other from their structure and with their refit and when they're doing new buildings as well. And all of this is working directly in to create that enabling policy change that we need to see. So we work with the Department for Education, and we support them not only in creating their sustainability and climate change strategy, but also now in the implementation of it. And we can see so that now every educational setting across England by 2025 will need a sustainability lead and will need a climate action plan. That's fantastic. They were two of our policy asks that are now being put into place. It's going to make a real difference. And I can already see a change happening with the management within schools because of that new strategy change. So schools are speaking up, they're showing their demand, working together, and they are creating change.
Lovely, thank you. And then if we can move on to Mike, if you can also introduce yourself and maybe explain a little bit about your work or how your company works with schools, and maybe the Blackburn diocese that I know you've done a lot of work with.
No problem at all. My name is Mike. I'm the Managing Director of Mantis Energy. We are a team of energy consultants and mechanical and electrical engineers. We work on a variety of building projects, mostly existing building retrofits. To date, we've been involved in 500 decarbonisation reports for schools. We're working currently in the region of 200 to 300 this year. And we've also been involved in successful SALEX funding applications for decarbonisation projects up to, I believe, about £25 million at the minute across approximately 25 schools. And the work that we get involved in is initially the decarbonisation reports, which is to identify how to decarbonise these schools. The nitty-gritty, the quite technical side of things, adding insulation, replacing windows, improving the air tightness of buildings, to the more advanced, adding heat pumps, replacing gas, oil boilers, adding solar panels, renewable technologies to the schools. And we're involved in firstly assessing that, how much it costs, does it stack up in terms of the government targets, and then also the actual design, detailed design and implementation. How do we add solid wall insulation to complicated old buildings? How do we add ground source heat pumps to large playing fields? And how do we upgrade plant rooms that are quite dated, in some cases, 50 years old? One of the main things that we're seeing with the work we're doing is just how varied schools can be, but also that they are extremely challenging buildings. They're not an office block. They're not a single house. They are buildings that have been retrofitted over the years. They're in some cases hundreds of years old. So they are by far the most difficult, but also the most interesting buildings that we work on. And it's been a really interesting journey so far. And we're really looking forward to the next few years because we see just a huge opportunity to improve the building stock.
Thank you. As you, Mike, referenced there, actually, that schools represent a unique set of challenges when it comes to decarbonising. They're not like other buildings. They're often older buildings, and also the sort of occupancy levels. There's nobody there in the summer, for example, and they're always occupied between the hours of 9 and 2:30, say. So they are quite specific to schools and school buildings. So if for the second question, if we can look at whether if we can kind of think about your experience with Blackburn to explain who is responsible for the buildings, because that's obviously another sort of uniqueness, if you like, for the school building sector. So who makes the decisions, who is in charge of them? Because it's not as simple as other building owners, is it? There's quite often lots of different layers of people involved in the decision making.
So we work with a variety of schools, academy trusts, VA schools. We work with the Diocese, Church of England schools, and they're all a little bit different hierarchies and people that approve certain things. So the Blackburn Diocese schools, as an example, we have the diocese that have applied for the funding. And then each school, especially in Blackburn Diocese, has associated building consultants that work with the schools to plan their extension works, retrofit works. And we also need to get buy-in. So the head teachers, the business managers, we need to talk through that process with them. So the first thing, I suppose, that we're doing is we're working with the diocese to work out which schools can obtain the funding which meets the current decarbonisation targets set by SALEX, through BAYS. And that's a really important thing, in that we are working with schools that are forthcoming with information, transparent, and give us the flexibility to, survey the schools during school term times and hours. We talk through the work that's going to be involved, the retrofit work, disruption to playing fields, roofs, doors, windows, everything that, may even occur during term time. And once we start getting that buy-in and we start understanding that it's a viable project, everyone's kind of in line and agreeing together, the project can go ahead. That makes it a lot simpler. And then it's a case of applying for that funding, obtaining the funding, and then agreeing with the schools what funding's been allocated, the works that are going on, and going through that very strategically and setting that programme of work. So there's a lot of project management involved. The key challenges and takeaways we find are around certainly, the heat pump side. Especially if we're looking at air source heat pumps or ground source heat pumps, is can it be done in term time? Does it need planning permission? Does the utility infrastructure need upgrading, and do we have to wait a certain period? And it's all about kind of keeping in touch with everyone, the head teachers, the business managers, the building consultants, and the diocese, who are, obtaining that funding from SALEX, as an example, to keep everyone in the loop.
So you've been talking quite a bit about the disruption caused there. So maybe if we could go to Nigel for this one. The disruption and the sort of occupancy creating challenges for a school's retrofit project. Is that something that you could talk to us about, your experience of whether you have to get things done in the school holidays or any kind of other challenges that might pose for you when you're looking at a decarbonisation project?
Okay, absolutely. Let's just focus on heat pumps, because as Mike has already said, that's probably the most challenging aspect. And it's probably the bit that the schools and colleges and their business managers and the senior leadership teams understand the least, because they will understand how behavioural change can mean that they use less energy, and that will save them money and cut carbon. Energy efficiencies, likewise, heat pumps, although it's a technology that has been around for a long time, not so well understood in this country. What we've found in a lot of the schools that we've worked in is that the design concept for the heat pump, and this tends to be more when it's a ground source solution rather than an air source solution, the design concept might mean that it needs to be a district heating system, which means that the heat is being generated in one place and then distributed around the school estate if it's more than just one building, rather than, as is commonly the case when you're in the fossil fuel regime, when you're still burning mains gas, or in some schools oil and LPG, you tend to have the gas distributed around from building to building, and then you have a plant room in each building. When you convert to renewable heat, there is a chance that that won't be the case, and you're going to introduce this thing called the district heating system. And that entails further groundworks around the estate, which you wouldn't have to do if you were just going to replace a mains gas boiler. If you're going to put a ground source heat pump in anyway, whether it's going into a district heating system or going straight into one heat pump in an existing plant room, there is going to need to be a ground array. So that is more groundworks. So I guess one of the disruptions is that we need to do what amounts to a construction project on the school estate. And it's not just like a new build where it's confined to one part of the estate, but it's going to go over the entire estate. If you just do the sort of time and space on the programme, it's highly unlikely, especially if you're doing a number of schools, like Mike's company has, and ReEnergise has also organised, it's highly unlikely that you're going to be able to do all of that during the holiday period. Some work is going to need to be done during term time. And also, if you consider the way in which the Salix funding process works, they, like all the public sector funding, they need to comply with annualisation. In other words, very often, well, in fact, entirely, the grant needs to be drawn down, all spent by the 31st of March in a given calendar year. And because the way the programme works, you do consultancy, design concept, design, etc., in the first half of what is quite often a 12-month period for a reasonable sized school estate. And then the second 6 months is likely to be the installation. That means that you've missed the summer holidays by the time you get to groundworks. You're doing it either during the winter term, or you're doing it sort of winter term, winter holidays, and then through into the new year. So I guess my message would be that rather than hoping that everything can be done in holiday periods, we need to accept that it can't be, and we need to manage work on the school estate while life goes on, because after all, they are educational establishments. They're not kind of playgrounds for us lot who like to do net zero retrofit projects, much fun though it is, and challenging and engaging and all of that. They're schools, and they've got to carry on doing their education. And certainly our experience in ReEnergise is that it's all perfectly achievable. It just requires a lot of care and attention and thought.
Thank you for that, Nigel. You mentioned there that perhaps the behavioural change aspects are sort of an easier thing for the schools to understand, which leads us nicely on to Alex. So could you talk to us about how important it is to get the kids and the teachers and the staff and everyone else involved in these kinds of decarbonisation plans, whether it is just a behavioural change project or a sort of what as part of a wider project at a school?
Well, the first thing to say is that the behaviours are absolutely key, and it comes down to why working with schools is so important. So we don't work with schools because they're a problem sector. We work with them actually because they're a real opportunity. They're an opportunity to influence and change wider society. We know that schools influence. And so some of that is about what they see in the buildings that they're in, but a lot of that is about behaviours and the way that everyone manages their buildings and the way that they behave within their buildings. And that we know goes beyond the school gates and out into communities. So yes, the buildings, the infrastructure is really key, and I'm not going to deny that retrofit is going to need to be a massive factor in all of this. But yes, if we can get the behaviours right to start off with, then we've got half a chance of getting the whole society to net zero as well. So looking at that influence, so 42% of our households have school age or younger children in them. So we know that we can reach out through schools. The other thing to think about is about really the efficiencies of the work that's done through retrofitting. So if you put a fantastic ground source heat pump into a school and that's brilliant, yet they leave all the windows open and they leave the heating up really high and the whole building leaks like a sieve, then it doesn't really have its sort of purpose, and the point is lost a bit. We've got to make sure that first of all, we're going with those low cost, no cost changes, heatings, timings, controls, switch offs, all the boring stuff that we've been doing for years and years, but get that really right, get all the insulation right, and then look at how we can retrofit. over 70% of England's school buildings are still going to be in use in 2050. We've got to do this. We've got to make these changes because we're stuck with the buildings that we all went to school in, that our children are currently learning in, that our grandchildren will also learn in. They're the same problem that we're very stuck with. And I sort of challenge the way that you said we need to get the students and parents and everything on board. Actually, they're the ones that got us on board, to be honest. I mean, it's a shame, but it took a whole load of young people marching through the streets, waving placards and shouting at us to get us all to sort of take notice. And that has been a big shift change. That's why so many schools are signing up to Let's Go Zero. That's why so many head teachers and governors and academy leads are really embracing this now. And then just to sort of, we were talking before, Mike was mentioning about that sort of people's understanding and who's leading in different areas. We've really seen that there's been a change in, as more schools are moving towards being larger academies, you're getting more specialists involved, which is nice to see. Everyone can argue one way or the other about academisation, but actually, when you have specialist estates managers, finance managers, and CEOs on board, you get a little bit more sensible decision making. We can see, so that's a sort of a good move from a sustainability side of things.
So from your perspective then, Alex, is it more that the children are going home and getting their parents on board and getting the teachers on board rather than the other way around? Is that what you're saying there?
It's a real mixture. We see that some of the schools, the changes are being led by individual champions within the staff. People who, we can see society is shifting. We're all a little bit more into a bit less meat, a bit more sustainability. Everyone gets the concept of carbon these days. But then sometimes it's real champions that come from the students, and sometimes it's from local groups or from parents. So it's a real mixture. But we're definitely seeing a big increase in the interest, enthusiasm, and need to be shown as leaders. They want to be the best. They can't quite put their finger on it, but they know that if your school is working towards net zero and the school down the road isn't, it's going to be good for your sign-up numbers. It's going to be good for your intake. So it's a marketing advantage.
Just to say, somebody's just added a question in the text box, in the chat box. So yeah, everybody, please do add your questions there, and we will get to them at the end. So Let's Go Zero 2030. 2030 is not that far away, is it really now? And there is obviously a lot to be done to get the thousands of schools in this country where they need to be. There's obviously an appetite for it from many of the schools, but how do we support that knowledge, that appetite? How do we support that will to decarbonise? So I think I'll go to Nigel first for this one. What do you think we need to have in place to support schools that want to decarbonise? What are the kind of tools that we need? I mean, we mentioned funding and how it's perhaps a little bit too complicated or doesn't work well with the academic year. But what do you think we need to have in place in an ideal world, if you could click your fingers and have everything that we needed in place?
Okay. Let's just tackle the funding bit. It's probably unfair of me to say that the funding is a bit complicated because, it falls to SALIX to administer it. And actually, that's quite a challenge because these grant regimes, the grant phases, at the moment it's Public Sector Decarbonisation Scheme, which pays for the capital works, and it's the Low Carbon Skills Fund, which pays the consultancy period, part of the work. And they launch a new phase, and they announce that a new phase is going to be launched sort of imminently, say in 4 weeks' time, and it opens on a given day. And I think SALIX, like all of us perhaps, have probably been surprised at the level of interest because the application process is swamped with applications. There's just, that's got to be a good thing in many ways. If there was sort of no applications at all, then we really would be a bit worried. But learning, if you're an individual school or a multi-academy trust and you want to get on, and like Alex has said, you want to be the sort of first one, not sort of being a sort of follower, but being a leader. then you need to submit a successful grant application. And I think that there is a technique to doing that successfully. You need to get your application prepared well in advance. You need to get all your ducks in a row as far as the data that needs to go into the grant application. Salix open the grant application windows currently at 2 p.m. on a given day, and the day is always announced in advance. And you need your finger on the buzzer at 2 p.m. because if there's, let's say Low Carbon Schools Fund Phase 3, which is now closed for new applications, there was £14 million in the pot to serve the entire nation, not just schools and colleges. When you asked for sort of what would my dream wish list be, that £14 million would have been just for schools and colleges. Never mind the rest of the country, they can go get their money from somewhere else. But anyway, that £14 million was gone within probably about half an hour. Salix would know exactly when, but it was massively oversubscribed. So you need to know how to do that right. And I'm sure Salix and Bayes and others will be considering, well, how could the application process be amended so it's not quite so frenetic on the day in question? But ultimately, there's not going to be enough funding in a given year to meet the entire demand. So I think that's important. I think it's important that we have an increasingly strong industrial base. The low carbon renewable energy sector is tiny compared to the oil and gas sector, and it needs to get to the same strength. Companies like Octopus Energy are doing great work to bring that along, and the momentum is building. I'd single out the Heat Pump Federation for a particular mention because they're helping a great deal, but it needs to be much larger than it is. And for it to be much larger than it is, we need to know that there is a regular pipeline of work, because you can't build up a company thinking that, well, this could all just go by the wayside next year. So there's a very clear message to government and local authorities communicating to government, and anyone that communicates to government. We need a reliable, consistent program of funding for the work that needs to be done. Otherwise, the industrial base just won't be built up. None of that need take away from Alex's side of the equation. The behaviour change thing is basically free. You do that with a sort of sweat of your brow and effort and so on. You don't need public funding to switch a light off. You just need the willpower to do it. But if you're going to do the buildings, I'm afraid you've got to have the money. So I think those would be my main ideas as far as that's concerned.
That's a great quote for the session, I think, there. You don't need funding, just switch a light off. So, Alex, moving on to you for this one. You've obviously seen loads of great stuff since Let's Go Zero launched, lots of great engagement from schools. So what lessons have you as an organisation learned so far from this? And what sort of message would you like to get out to school leaders, school business managers, whoever it may be, who are interested in cutting their carbon? What are the sort of key things that you've learned so far from your work?
So there's two areas really just to cover on, and firstly just to comment on what Nigel just said about the funding, and a bit complicated. I think that's the nicest I've ever heard it referred to as. Normally there's a lot more sort of other sort of words involved in that. Yes, so the public sector decarbonisation funding is horrible. Let's just be very honest. The systems to apply for it are complicated. The timings are terrible, and it's not fairly distributed. We know that it doesn't go proportionately to enough educational settings. They know that in government as well, and they are working on it. And they really are. I mean that there are teams of people who are trying to make it work better. So we can only be hopeful that at each round as it comes along, it will get better, and it might start being more fairly proportionately divvied up each time. We'll keep our fingers crossed for that. My advice on that kind of funding is team up. Don't try to do these forms yourselves. Don't try and do it as individual schools or even necessarily as individual trusts. Team up with other schools, with local authority, with all the businesses out there that will help you do it, with your diocese, with everyone. group up together. It's fewer people filling in forms to get the same thing. There's no difference between a single application and a multiple application in terms of your chance of getting it. Doesn't make you more likely, but it just means it's fewer people doing all the legwork. So team up and use the expertise that's out there. That's my key thing on that. Now, what we see really working is when our school leaders are being demanding and ambitious. That's what we want to see, and that's where we see it really working. So when they are asking for more, expecting more through their supply chains, through their procurement, through the work they're doing on their sites and across all of their estates, being that voice for change and asking for something better, so that you can push and nudge those supply chains to shift towards better solutions. If we all keep asking for a better service, we will get it. And I'm seeing that already in terms of school catering providers are shifting what they're doing, because a lot of schools are asking for lower meat, lower carbon, more sustainable food, and they are jumping at it, and they are delivering that already. And then look at how they can lead by example. And that's really important through modelling their behaviours, so doing amazing things within their own schools and colleges and across their own estates, and then telling everyone about it, partly to get a good bit of marketing and comms from it, but also let's stop everyone having to reinvent the wheel. We don't need any more wheels in this. We just need everyone to do all the great stuff that already exists. So be demanding, take some great action, and then tell people about it and share with others. So that's the sort of the messaging that I would give.
That's brilliant advice, I think. And for you, Mike, what would you add to what Nigel and Alex have said about your sort of key takeaways from the work that you've been doing with schools?
Well, we've got a lot of key takeaways from the schools and everything that we've learned with the decarbonisation plans. I think the key thing that we're recognising is you can't just say, I want to decarbonise a school or make a school net zero without a plan. And this decarbonisation plan is absolutely a crucial step in the journey. A lot of people are trying to run before they can walk. And it's kind of like, if you don't know how much emissions your school's currently emitting, how to actually decarbonise or make the school zero carbon, you don't know where you stand. And we get a lot of schools, a lot of academy trusts, the diocese, different dioceses contacting us, asking us, saying we've got these schools, they're on oil boilers, the boilers are 40 years old, and the buildings aren't insulated. We need to tackle them. We need to decarbonise them. The challenge we currently have with that is just because their schools are in need of retrofit, in need of upgrade, doesn't mean they currently meet a decarbonisation plan that is commercially or technically viable. So we actually have to start looking at these schools individually and as a whole. Let's say we look at a section of 200 schools in a part of the northwest of the UK or the south or wherever, and we find out that actually with the current decarbonisation scheme guidance or requirements, only 20 of those schools actually meet the funding criteria to fully decarbonise. That's a key takeaway there, is that just because a school needs help at the minute doesn't mean we can use the frameworks and the funding to help them. And that's where maybe more of the behavioural side comes in. But again, it's having that plan to say, you've got an oil boiler, you've got walls that can be insulated, you've got a playing field that can be utilised for a ground source heat pump. Do the numbers stack up? Is this commercially viable? And then you can actually move into the next step. Key learnings that we're finding as well is that the decarbonisation plans need to be as detailed as possible. We do sometimes get resistance when we say, look, a decarbonisation plan is going to cost a few £1,000s, and a school says, no, we don't want to spend that much money on paperwork, on consultancy reports. And we say, well, it's aimed at applying for £1 million worth of funding. And very quickly, when you realise the cost versus the benefit of those studies and plans, it's a challenge we're finding. If you can apply for the funding and get your plans covered, great. If not, you're going to miss the boat. There's the decarbonisation plan schemes are available and the funding is here, but you're only going to be considered if you apply. Now, there are certainly challenges, as Nigel and Alex had mentioned, which is, you apply, and if you don't apply within half an hour, you don't get the funding. There are certainly other sectors that are getting a lot of funding as well, the public sector buildings. So you're in kind of the running with them. My kind of overall key takeaway is that there should actually be a separate decarbonisation funding scheme just for education. I'm hoping those discussions are happening. We're, being very open with SALEX and the government to be able to provide that data, in that schools have unique challenges in that they are not office blocks, they are not copy and paste buildings. They do actually require, in some cases, more funding to decarbonise than other building types. So when we look at a stock of, as I say, the 200-300 buildings, only 20 are actually meeting the current funding criteria. How do we decarbonise the other buildings that we can't currently get funding for? We need tens of millions of pounds to decarbonise these buildings, and because they're running on a gas boiler instead of an oil boiler, or because they have a tiny amount of insulation but still not enough to fully decarbonise the building, they don't meet that criteria. So I feel like right now we're tackling the really challenging schools, the schools that are on really old oil boilers, really poorly insulated, have a great opportunity to be upgraded. But there's this huge kind of middle section of schools that we're not even thinking about yet, because they don't meet any funding criteria at all. So there's a huge challenge there to provide that education to SALEX, the government, and also the schools themselves, to be realistic. If you have a school in the middle of nowhere that has planning issues, that doesn't have large playing fields, that has challenging grade 2 listed building types or fabrics, it's going to be incredibly difficult to decarbonise. We have to start thinking a bit outside the box for that as well.
Could I just add to,
yeah, of course,
just backing up what Mike said about the plans and the fact that you need a decent plan. As far as an estate decarbonisation plan is concerned, you get what you pay for. And one of the issues at the moment is that, there is a sort of framework for what a plan should look like, and I think gradually, the industry is coming over to how you do a plan. There are not really clearly defined standards as far as what makes a good estate decarbonisation plan versus what doesn't actually cut it. SALEX put out guidance, SALEX issue examples of good plans and so on. But one of the issues is that you can have a plan which costs, under £1,000, and you can have a plan that could cost, say, maybe £10,000 to £15,000 for the same school estate. And the school will need to decide, which is right for me. Almost unquestionably, 99 times out of 100, the more expensive plan, provided it's not, taking it to a ridiculous extent, the more expensive plan is going to be the one that actually meets the requirement, because it's a complex thing that needs to be planned carefully. And I think it's quite difficult for schools to recognise when they're going to get value for money when it comes to plans, because they might, say, run a tender exercise for who's going to do this plan for us, and they get a range of submissions back, and you get a price range like that. You're not going to go for the cheapest because nobody ever does. Very unlikely to go for the most expensive because nobody ever does. You're probably going to go somewhere in between. But actually, how do you know you're going to get value for money? And you don't know whether you got value for money until you see the plan, and you may not even know whether the plan actually meets the requirement from an engineering point of view. You probably understand it from a commercial point of view, but you won't, unless you're a specialist, know whether it's sort of cutting it from an engineering point of view. So I suppose my advice to the audience would be, do not be unduly concerned if you are thinking, well, this is all rather expensive. It is rather expensive. And as Mike has said, if you're lining yourself up to do, let's say, £1 million conversion project, that is going to require careful planning, because what you don't want to do is spend that £1 million poorly, because in a few years' time it'll come back and bite you.
So is there support out there to
can I come in on the stuff that's going on there? And that's Yeah, so it's a really interesting area about that sort of looking and being brave and understanding. And we are often talking about very large sums of money. And the thing that we always know is a challenge is that the person that's making the decision, it's not their money, it's not their building, and the children in the building are not their children. So we do know that there is this big gap between what people are happy to agree with and what they're not. And actually, from a demographics point of view, the people that make the decision will normally have left the school or will have retired by the time that legacy comes through. So they don't want to be the person that left the school with this terrible debt or awful building or whatever. So we know there's a big problem there. So we did a finance roundtable recently with a whole lot of different finance organisations and different people from the sector and Department for Education, pulling together, okay, what are the barriers? What are the challenges, and how can we overcome them? And something that we're looking at is putting that, and it's that retrofit for dummies type guidance, which I know is terribly insulting to call it that, but it's explaining to people who are experts in something else how you can do this and how you can make those decisions, and just breaking it down a bit, the different types of finance, the different types of equipment, kit, retrofit, all the different things. So explaining it so that your decision maker at a school can make that confident decision in an area that is not their area of expertise.
I think you're exactly right, Alex. I mean, and that kind of comes full circle to you saying ask for help, get those specialists, consultants and people involved to kind of spread the load, because as I say, the SALEX funding applications are complicated. Decarbonisation plans are complicated. And to reiterate what Nigel said, we've been privy to, completely transparent, other decarbonisation plans with schools where they've either not been happy with the quality of them, or there's been a kind of consortium of decarbonisation plans that have been shared, and I can't tell you how varied they are in terms of quality. We look at kind of the SALEX as a basic, the template for decarbonisation as a basic guideline, and we go much further into levels of detail. The reason being is the fundamental reason why these decarbonisation plans need to be so robust is you apply for £500,000, you get £500,000 to spend based on strict criteria. If your decarbonisation plan can't achieve that criteria, you've miscalculated the costs, or the energy savings aren't as good as you thought, it can impact not only the funding you're currently receiving or won't receive, but future funding applications as well. So I don't want to be like the scaremonger. It's more about, if you have a robust decarbonisation plan, you know what you're spending your money on, you know what you're getting, and you have much more confidence going into those applications, where you can then start saying, well, I'm not just going to apply for one school, I might apply for 5 schools, 10 schools, 20 schools. And this is the challenge we have. We have thousands, I think over 10,000 schools when you add them all up, and that may be just the primary and secondary schools. And we need to start, currently we look at decarbonisation funding where we apply for 5 to 15, 20 schools at a time. But actually, quite near in the future, we need to start doing decarbonisation schemes where it's 100 schools at a time. Yeah, there you go, 32,000 schools. It's a huge challenge. And, at the minute, we're having SALEX announce funding for 5 schools, funding for 10 schools. There's such a huge scale up required in what we're doing. We're just scratching the surface.
We have got a guide to decarbonisation planning in schools and colleges. We do not call it retrofit for dummies. Maybe we should change the title, and then it will sort of catch more attention. So anyone is welcome to have a copy of that if they want. I'm not here to do a commercial by way, but I just want to mention that.
We'll add a link to that so people can get it after the session. Where you were just talking about scale, it's probably a good idea to go to, there's a question from Alice in the chat box, and she said, has the potential for collective procurement or procurement at scale been looked at, i.e. procuring retrofit works, heat pumps, etc., for multiple schools to help benefit from economies of scale? I don't know if anyone has a strong urge to answer this. Mike's put his hand up. Do you want to jump in?
we've done it already. So we're working on a 10-school project at the minute, all within a local area that needs solar panels. So there is a large procurement of those solar panels under a single contractor to benefit from that economies of scale. But what I will say is, with the technology that we're dealing with, we're not going to see those economies of scale really kick in until there's a much larger volume. So 50, 100 school plus, at the minute when you go to a heat pump supplier and you say you want 10 heat pumps and you say, we're doing it for 10 schools, can you offer a discount? They kind of go, well, not really. The equipment costs a certain amount, and they kind of leave you hanging. But if you went to them and said, well, we need 100 heat pumps, the discussion is certainly more open to some kind of economies of scale. Challenge you always have with schools is it's not like a housing estate where you have 100 houses all in the same location. They are dotted around in rural locations, in cities. There are various challenges. So I think economies of scale in procurement of parts, there is certainly an opportunity once you get above a certain number of schools. But just to add to that question and kind of make a comment, there are still challenges with the actual implementation of those materials and parts, just because the labour is quite varied, very different fabric building types. Never found two schools that are alike yet.
That kind of links on to another question, which I think is probably going to be easily answered by one of you. So if schools aren't insulated efficiently, are heat pumps going to be effective? So is it worth sticking a heat pump into a school building that's not insulated efficiently?
I'll give it a go. So you can install a heat pump in any school. You can actually install a heat pump in a school that is not improved or retrofitted right now. The challenge you have is that it needs to be a very high temperature heat pump. It needs to provide the same hot water as a gas boiler or an oil boiler. It needs to work exactly the same as the system that's currently there. The challenge with that is that they work very inefficiently at high temperatures. Now, they're getting better and they're improving, but what that then means is high running costs. We know that electricity is more expensive than gas and oil, even though the gap between the utility costs is closing. The other challenges we can have is that if you don't insulate the building and you try to run these heat pumps at lower temperatures, you need very big radiators, fan radiators, distribution systems that become commercially unviable. So I suppose the go-to kind of strategy is fabric first, reduce the energy use of the school, improve the insulation. And what that then means is that the heat pumps don't need to be as large, the heating infrastructure doesn't need to be as big, and the operating cost is much lower. And then you can also look into renewable technologies to reduce the running cost of that heat pump. But certainly with a boiler or a heat pump, a more insulated building is always going to be more effective using a heat pump.
I'll just add that the business of the fabric, that works for gas boilers as well. I think people sometimes think, well, and before I put in a heat pump, I've got to make my building more energy efficient and so on. And I totally agree with Mike. It's good if you can, but it's not the end of the world if you can't. But you should be doing it anyway. Even if you're going to be stuck with a gas boiler for the next 10 years, if you can make your building more energy efficient, you're going to use a heck of a lot less gas. And if you're using a heck of a lot less gas, that is less carbon emissions. That's all helping towards net zero.
Yeah, and just that, so it's so important to get that use down first. I mean, why even look at how on earth you're going to generate it if you don't need it to start off with? Just absolute simple, closing doors and windows and basic housekeeping changes, just being responsible can cut your energy use down by sort of 10%. And then, then do a switch off campaign, then do this, then do that. I mean, it can really make a massive difference just cutting the use. So if you have your heating on for simply in your school for half an hour less each day, so rather than having it come on at 6, you have it coming at 6:30 or whatever it is. Every day, doesn't make the slightest bit of difference. Nobody notices. Every single day that adds up. So that's a big chunk of heat you then don't have to generate. And then you can start looking at what sort of a capacity you need with either your boiler or your ground source heat pump or something. But just don't worry about the heat that you might not need to generate to start off with, just by being more efficient. And just in case anyone ever wonders, the ideal classroom temperature is 19 degrees. That's it. No questions. Doesn't matter whether Mrs. Smith in year 3 is a bit cold. It's 19 degrees. The unions agree. There's no debate about it. So it is the best temperature for learning and working. And it's colder than that in the halls, in the bathrooms, in the corridors. So, it should be 19 degrees. And most schools I go to are comfortable 24 in the winter, and you've got your coat on outside and your singlet on inside. So that's something we need to get right from the beginning.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I've got a great example, actually. The school that I went to a couple of weeks back when we were having, I think it was a heat wave, one of the hottest days of the year so far. And all the heating was on in the school. And it was absolutely roasting. And we asked the question, why is the heating on? They said, well, we don't know how to control it. So we're still dealing with these challenges today where heating's being left on all night. In some cases, because if the boilers are turned off, they won't turn back on again. So there's other challenges there. But to just go back to that question in terms of insulating efficiently, a heat pump's going to be effective. There's a little add-on to that as well, which is about insulating buildings to make heat pumps effective, but we're actually insulating buildings to reduce the size of heat pumps as well. And one of the main reasons behind that is utility infrastructure. You might hear about people talking about if you added all, every house in the UK had a EV charger or a heat pump, would the network be able to handle it? Well, if you added a heat pump to every single school in the UK, would the network be able to handle it? And not right now is the answer, but also the costs involved. So we're finding some really big challenges with schools before they even get off the ground is the utility side. If you're going to add air source heat pumps to a school or ground source heat pumps, you're adding a lot of electrical demand to that school. The surrounding infrastructure might have just had some new housing estates, or the substation close by has just been utilised for a large building, and those upgrades can cost a huge amount. We have seen ranges from £5,000 to upgrade the supply, or zero cost to upgrade the supply, up to £600,000 is the highest one we found. It completely kills projects. So another thing about having a decarbonisation plan in place is looking at that utility infrastructure to make sure you can even add this sort of technology in the first place. It's really important.
I think we've probably got time for one final question, which came from LinkedIn, and this is to do with the monitoring of the school performance in use. So kind of one step further from what we've been talking about, really. So once the decarbonisation has all gone swimmingly, what is then done to monitor it, to make sure, as Mike was saying, that it matches up with the energy saving predictions or any other criteria? So whose job is that? Who does that, and how important is it? I don't know who wants to answer that one.
I'll start by saying that actually, if you want the right solution as far as heat is concerned, it's interesting. This webinar almost seems to become almost entirely sort of heat retrofit into challenging buildings, which maybe wasn't entirely the intention. Certainly, some of the more complicated sites, if you want to get the right fit, particularly for heat pumps operating at lower flow temperatures than combustion systems, it's really better if you can do heat monitoring before you do the retrofit, because then you'll understand more about how the heat's being distributed around the estate. As far as monitoring the results are concerned afterwards, I mean, in most of the instances we've been involved in, it's probably too early to tell whether it's doing exactly what it says on the tin. These systems are being installed to last for decades, and we're only at the start of this. Well, I don't know if there's anything coming out of sort of the Blackburn experience, whether that's gone far enough yet to be able to say whether the systems are working as intended. So I'll kind of hand it over to Mike, really.
Yeah, so ultimately, we're here to find out how to create zero carbon schools. How do we get these schools to net zero carbon? So we have to be able to measure that. So we come up with a plan that says the school was emitting 150 tonnes. We've got a plan, it's going to go down to 5 tonnes, and we might offset that by being on a renewable energy tariff or planting trees, however you do that, and you get to your net zero. When you apply for SAILEX funding, you need to have a monitoring and verification plan. And part of that plan is to measure the emissions and work out, is this school now emitting only 5 tonnes of CO2? So what we have in place and what we've applied to 25 schools now is detailed monitoring packages. And what I mean by that is a lot of schools have smart meters. Some of them still don't, but that's another issue. And that provides data of how much energy is being used, but it doesn't really tell the full story. So, you can quite easily see that if you've got a gas meter and an electric meter and they're providing readings, you decarbonize the building, you think it's net zero, and then you get rid of the gas meter, you have the electric meter, and this is showing a much lower reading, but it's not always the case. It might be showing a slightly higher reading than you're expecting, and we need to know where that's coming from. So the monitoring equipment we install in schools is much more advanced. It looks at how much electricity is the heat pump using, the lighting, the kitchen, the ventilation, the computer equipment, and soon, it might be EV chargers in the car parks, how much renewable energy is being generated on the roof. And we can very quickly get an idea of, okay, we've decarbonized, we've lowered the carbon of the building, but we've still got some work to go. It's a really important thing that we're collecting data, and as Nigel rightly said, it's still going to take a long time to collect that data and really say, how much of an effect we're having. And that's primarily because of how we're using the buildings. So, summer holidays, full years, term times changing, we're still in buildings that need to have their windows opened and keep well ventilated. So there are challenges there that mean we have to record this data for a number of years. But what we're seeing is, really useful data that we're gathering is showing that, when you get rid of a gas or an oil boiler, those emissions are gone. You're now dealing with this electric emission. And one of the ways to decarbonising we've seen is, if you want to fully decarbonise a school and monitor it properly, you need to fully insulate the building, electrify the heating system or decarbonise it, and you need to add renewable technology. And then you can monitor that and verify it.
I'll just add in there that, yes, data is really important, and you can't really manage something unless you can measure it in some way, shape or form. But don't let it be a barrier to taking action. We are also so far off anything to do with anywhere near net zero or zero. We don't need to worry about exact numbers yet. Get a sense of the scale, get a sense of the problem areas, use the data for that, work on getting the data better, but don't wait. You don't need to wait until you've got a beautiful set of data before you start taking action. Get started, get going, and along the way, get your data sorted while you're doing it. You're going to need to report. We can see the signs coming pretty clearly from DFE that there's going to need to be some mandatory reporting coming pretty soon. So you might as well be getting your act together on that from a data side of things.
Yeah, we work with a number of schools. Somewhere we're installing monitoring equipment now, so they can help with the behavioural changes. Somewhere it's only during decarbonisation planning or once they've received funding. There's no right or wrong answer, but the sooner you can start taking action, reducing the energy use, the sooner you'll start wanting to know more about the school. And I think one of the key points I find, and we were talking about this offline before the webinar started, was children are really interested in this data. If you can tell them how much energy the school's using, how much the solar panels have generated today, you've got a great audience there that are really interested and keen to take that data. They talk to the parents, they talk to the teachers about it, they spread a huge message about what they're doing. And we had a school in Preston. It was called Chorley St Lawrence, that was actually in a couple of news articles. And when we started talking about these technologies, putting heat pumps in, getting rid of gas, the interest from the children was amazing about just the technologies, and they want to be in carbon neutral, zero carbon schools. They want to work in an environment, and I think that's what we want for them as well. These are places of education which should promote sustainability, and actually they're some of the poorest performing buildings in the UK. So there's a disconnect there, definitely.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. That is all we've got time for today. Thank you to Nigel, Alex and Mike for joining us. And the session will be available to watch on demand afterwards. For anyone that missed it, you can forward it on to them. And yeah, thank you very much. And I'll see everyone in September when our next series of webinars starts.